In the dense pines and quiet shadows of willows, a girl in a nightgown runs through the fog as if life itself is chasing her down. No one hears the sobs caught in her throat. No one sees the bruises beneath the thin fabric. And when the bus crosses the town's border with a nameless passenger aboard, a royal wedding quietly collapses into a violent investigation. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the most shocking, haunting, and emotional episodes we're bringing to you soon. The sun dipped low over the quiet fields of willows, a rural town so small that strangers were noticed before they even crossed the edge of its cracked asphalt roads. Dusk bled across golden wheat fields as if someone had spilled melted honey over the land. And there, nestled between a rusted mailbox and a wind-warped fence, sat the home where Chloe lived. A house that looked warm from the outside, but held secrets behind every curtain. Chloe was 22, too young to have learned how to surrender, but too exhausted to keep fighting battles no one else saw. To the town, she was the lucky daughter of the prestigious Lavelle family, heirs to the farmland that had kept Willows afloat during the last two droughts. To her parents, she was currency. Inside the house, the walls wore photographs like medals of false honor, images of smiling harvests and staged family dinners. But no one ever looked too closely at Chloe's eyes in those frames. Not even Chloe. She sat at her wooden desk upstairs, the lamp's flicker echoing the tremble in her hands. A leather-bound journal lay open. Her pen scratched the page like a whisper fighting to be heard. If I'm gone by the time you read this, please don't look for me. This was the only door left open. Outside the door, voices. Her mother's, high and sharp, instructing the delivery men where to place the wedding gown. Chloe could hear the plastic garment bag crackle as it was laid across the sofa like a body prepared for burial. The dress was ivory, expensive, hand-stitched by a woman flown in from Quebec. But to Chloe, it looked like a veil over a casket, hers. Daniel, her intended, was 44, a business associate of her father, rich in assets and even richer in whispered stories. He'd been married before, once, briefly. The woman had left town with a black eye and a sealed court file. Chloe had asked about it once. Her father had narrowed his eyes and said, "He's a man who knows how to discipline. That's what real men do." She never asked again. Downstairs, laughter spilled from the living room. Her mother was pouring wine, chattering about catering and floral arrangements. Every sentence sounded like a verdict. Chloe's door was locked, but not to keep people out. It was to stop herself from bolting into the hallway and screaming that she didn't want any of this. The pen slipped from her fingers. She pressed both palms to her chest, trying to calm the thudding panic. Through the window, the golden fields waved, indifferent, a mocking freedom. She turned the page. "I've been planning this for 27 days. Each day, I wake up pretending I'll go through with it. But every night, I mark another step closer to leaving. If this were a fairy tale, someone would save me. But there are no fairy tales in Willows." The house was large but made of silence. The kind of silence that echoes when someone's hope begins to rot. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. Chloe tensed. She slid the journal under her mattress just as the doorknob jiggled. "Chloe, honey, you've been in there too long. You'll miss dinner." It was her mother. Chloe stared at the door. Locked. But it felt useless, like trying to barricade a flood with tissue paper. "I'm coming," she said softly, throat dry. The footsteps retreated. She waited 10 more seconds before reaching into the closet and pulling out a duffel bag. Inside were clothes, cash she'd been hiding behind old encyclopedias, a prepaid phone she'd bought under the name Clarissa, and a map. Not a GPS, not a digital app, a physical map, creases like battle scars, markings in red ink. One route out. She traced it with her finger as if drawing power from the ink. Willows, Grover's Pass, Asheville, anywhere but here. She exhaled through her teeth. The window creaked as she opened it just an inch. The air smelled like soil and wildflowers. And gasoline from the pickup truck parked below, her escape vehicle. She had learned to drive stick shift 2 years ago, under the pretense of helping on the farm. Her father had called her his little tomboy. She smiled at the memory, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They don't see me," she wrote in her journal days earlier. "They see the role I'm supposed to play. And I've played it so long, I don't know where the mask ends and I begin." She moved to the vanity, the same one her mother had used as a bride. It was carved oak, ornate, and in its reflection, Chloe looked like a ghost rehearsing how to haunt. The mirror didn't show fear, it showed calculation. She picked up a hairbrush, began to comb through the thick auburn waves. She would braid it tonight, like always, but tomorrow she'd cut it. Short, unrecognizable. She'd dye it if she had time. She imagined looking into another mirror in a different state, seeing a stranger she could learn to love. Downstairs, Daniel had arrived. She heard his voice before she saw his shadow stretch across the hallway. He was laughing, loud, confident, like a man used to owning rooms and women alike. Chloe froze, heart thudding like fists on a door. He didn't knock. He never knocked. "She'll be down in a minute," her mother said with the edge of steel beneath the silk of her tone. "You know girls, always getting ready." "Let her take her time," Daniel replied. "We'll have all the time in the world once she's mine." Chloe backed away from the door. "Meinetron shemainon neerd." The words slithered into her lungs and tightened. She moved quickly now, hiding the bag behind the armchair in the corner, slipping on a sweater and rubbing her face to erase the panic. 7 more days until the wedding. But she only needed 1 more night. The journal's last entry was left unfinished. "If you find this and I'm gone, don't be angry. Just understand, a house can have 100 locks, but if it was never built with a door, then it was never meant for someone to leave. And I was born in this house not to stay, but to find the courage to run." The camera panned slowly away from the room, through the window, over the fields. Chloe's silhouette lingered in the glass like an echo of someone already disappearing. And in the distance, the wind stirred the wheat, not with chaos, but with warning. To be continued." The rain had been falling since dusk, not in sheets but in whispers, like the sky was too afraid to cry out loud. The drops clung to the roof of the Lavelle house and rolled down the window glass like second thoughts. Inside, the wedding dress still lay on the sofa untouched, its lace sleeves limp like arms too tired to fight. Chloe stood at the back door barefoot, wearing only a pale nightgown and a cardigan she'd once stolen from her mother's closet. She clutched the leather-bound journal under her arm and a small canvas pouch tucked into the side of her bra. Inside it, $170 in small bills, folded meticulously and counted a dozen times. Her hands were cold, and her breath fogged in the air as she took one last glance over her shoulder. The house didn't glow like a home. It loomed like a courthouse, and she was the condemned. Her father was asleep. Her mother had taken sleeping pills. Daniel had left earlier after whispering a promise about forever with a squeeze that still ached along her forearm. His grip had left a bruise the shape of his intentions. She opened the door and stepped into the night. The gravel path felt sharp against her soles, but she didn't stop. Not for shoes, not for reason. Her heart had already bolted miles ahead of her. The wind stirred her hair into a wild crown as she made her way to the edge of the property. There, parked beneath the hollow shadow of a dying oak, was the town's only secret that never judged: the midnight bus route. The Willows bus stop wasn't even marked anymore. Just a rusted bench and a plastic shelter with graffiti scraped into the sides. Chloe sat, soaking, trembling, eyes locked on the road. The headlights arrived like a signal from another world. The bus hissed to a stop. Its doors opened with a mechanical sigh, like even the machine was tired. The driver didn't ask questions. He just stared at her drenched figure, his eyes pausing on her bare feet and shivering hands. "Where to?" he grunted. "Anywhere, not here." She dropped her crumpled bills into the fare slot and walked to the middle of the bus, sitting 2 rows behind a man who smelled like oil and onions. A woman with chipped nail polish was sprawled across the back row, muttering in her sleep. As the engine roared and the wheels turned away from the ghost town that birthed her, Chloe felt her lungs release for the first time in years. She pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the fields disappear into a smear of shadow and rain. She didn't cry. Not yet. But she could feel the pressure build like storm clouds behind her ribs. The bus swayed gently as it rolled past forgotten farms and into the blur of early morning. Chloe's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the echo of Daniel's grip, the way he'd smiled as his thumb pressed into the bone just beneath her wrist during their last private meeting. "You'll be mine soon," he had whispered, eyes like cut glass. "And I don't share." She hadn't responded. She had only nodded, trained well enough to keep her mouth shut even as every cell inside her screamed. Now, seated among strangers with no names, she allowed herself to breathe, shallow and unsteady. The smell of wet wool and cigarette smoke filled the cabin. Somewhere behind her, the driver coughed twice, like punctuation in the silence. Sleep found her not with softness, but like a thief, sudden, jarring. She drifted into unconsciousness, clutching the journal like a shield across her chest. Her dream was sharp, too vivid. She stood in a room made of mirrors, and every reflection was her face, bruised, hollow, cracking. Daniel stood behind each one, multiplying like a virus. Every time she turned, another version of him appeared, reaching, mocking. "You thought you could run? You're just a pretty thing on a leash." She screamed, but no sound came. Then suddenly she was in a field, alone. The mirrors gone, the rain falling sideways, and she was barefoot again, trying to run but sinking in mud with every step. She jolted awake, her mouth dry. The bus had stopped. She blinked at the overhead lights in the unfamiliar station around her. Concrete walls, vending machines blinking tired ads, a row of plastic chairs nailed to the ground. Sacramento outskirts. She was almost there. She tried to stand, but her legs folded beneath her. Her head spun, her lips pale. She hadn't eaten since noon the day before. Her vision blurred. She made it to the door, stumbling into the night air, only to collapse under the overhang of the wooden shelter outside. The rain had stopped, but her skin was soaked through, her breath shallow. That's where he found her. A man in his 60s with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much war to be startled by a girl on the ground. He had stepped out for a cigarette between shifts. A janitor, maybe. Or maybe just someone who didn't want to sleep. He crouched beside her, hesitant, then took off his jacket and placed it over her shoulders. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey, you okay?" She didn't answer. He saw the bruises, the cracked lip, the way she recoiled at even gentle touch. She wasn't okay. He didn't ask again. He stood and waved down the only other living thing in the area, a young woman in a red hoodie with a phone in her hand. "Call someone," he said. "This girl needs help." But Chloe, through the haze, opened her eyes just enough to whisper, "No cops." The man studied her a second longer. Then he nodded once, quietly agreeing to a pact he hadn't asked for. He helped her sit up, gave her a bottle of water from his bag. She drank, coughed, wiped her mouth with the sleeve of someone else's kindness. "Name?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "Claire," she lied. He smiled a little, as if he knew it was a lie and didn't care. "Well then, Claire," he said, "you're not the first to land here with nothing but the rain and a story they can't tell." The shelter lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, but not for her. Not tonight. For the first time in her life, Chloe realized she might disappear into a place and not be missed. And somehow, that was the beginning of her freedom. Not to be continued. She didn't remember how the truck smelled or how long the drive had lasted. Only the sound of rain on a windshield and the rhythm of her own teeth chattering. When Chloe opened her eyes again, the world had gone still. Not silent, but still, like someone had laid a hand on the chaos and told it to wait outside. The bed beneath her wasn't a hospital cot, nor was it the stiff back row of the bus. It was soft, layered with old quilts that smelled of cedar and thyme. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner of the room, its gentle crackling the only sound aside from the occasional groan of the forest outside. The window was cracked open, just enough to let in the scent of pine. Outside, trees stood like quiet sentinels, tall and unmoving in the morning fog. There were no fences, no footsteps, no questions. Only warmth. Chloe stirred, the soreness in her body a reminder that she was still alive, though barely tethered to the life she'd reclaimed. She tried to sit up, but her limbs didn't cooperate. Everything ached. Then she noticed the note on the nightstand. A small square of paper folded once. Next to it sat a cup of tea, still warm, steam curling gently upward like smoke from a fading memory. She reached for the note with fingers that trembled. "You don't have to say anything. When you're ready to talk, I'll be here. M." And below the initial, a drawing of a bird, simple, almost childlike. But something about it made her throat tighten. A bird in flight, escaping. Her eyes flicked to the book beside the note. Its leather spine was worn, corners soft from use. The Old Man and the Sea. She smiled faintly. She'd read it in high school but had never understood why people called it a masterpiece. Now she did. It wasn't about fish or the ocean. It was about endurance. The kind that breaks your bones slowly but keeps your heart beating anyway. The door opened behind her. Soft, unhurried steps entered. She turned her head and saw him, Marcus. Tall, broad-shouldered, maybe early 50s. His face was lined like the bark of the trees that framed his cabin, and his eyes, gray but not cold, had the steady calm of someone who'd stopped looking for answers a long time ago. He didn't speak, just placed a bowl of broth on the table and nodded toward it. She nodded back. He left again without a word. Chloe's hands wrapped around the ceramic bowl like it was a lifeline. She sipped slowly, the warmth burning down her throat, chasing the cold that had settled deep in her ribs. That night she slept again. But this time the dreams were crueler. She stood in the hallway of her childhood home, the walls breathing, the lights flickering. Her father's voice echoed from below. "Chloe, Chloe, where are you?" But it wasn't anger, it was fear, panic. She saw him then, her father in a suit wrinkled from sleep, his eyes red, his mouth open as he shouted her name again and again into the dark. And behind him her mother, arms crossed, whispering something too quiet to hear. The dream shifted. Chloe was on the church altar, the wedding veil over her face, suffocating her. Daniel stood beside her, gripping her wrist hard enough to break bone. The priest spoke, but the words were static. The guests had no faces. She screamed, but no one looked up. She jolted awake, the blankets twisted around her legs like restraints. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She shoved them aside, sat up, wiped the sweat from her forehead with a trembling palm. The window now showed morning light. Pale and hesitant, she stood, took one step toward the door, and collapsed. Her knees gave out, her vision dimmed, and the floor rushed up to greet her like a judgment. The world vanished in a blur of wood grain. When she woke again, she was back in the bed, the tea now cold. This time a different note awaited. "Tried to stand too soon, huh? Don't rush, your body's catching up to your soul. Fine." She exhaled through her nose, a quiet, humorless laugh. Marcus was a man of few words, but each one landed like truth. Hours passed, maybe days. She didn't ask. Marcus brought food, mended her sweater, and once, when her hands were shaking too badly to hold the spoon, he wordlessly fed her, eyes never meeting hers, as if dignity could be preserved in the silence. The cabin was small but alive with stories. Carvings hung on the walls. Wooden animals, old tools turned into sculptures, one photograph of a woman standing on a dock, hair caught in the wind, smiling at someone outside the frame. Chloe knew it was her, the woman Marcus had lost. She didn't ask, but the grief hung in the air like an unfinished song. One evening she found a stack of letters by the fireplace, handwritten, unsent, addressed to Lena. She didn't read them, but she pressed her hand to the top envelope, closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry." It felt like prayer. By the third morning, Chloe could walk. She made it to the kitchen where Marcus sat at a table carving what looked like a small bird, the same one he'd drawn on the note. When he saw her, he offered no congratulations, no praise, just slid the kettle toward her and went back to carving. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. Minutes passed. Then finally she spoke. "My name's not Claire," she said softly. Marcus didn't look up. "I know." Silence again. Then he asked, "You running from someone?" She paused. "No, I'm running from everyone." He nodded. "That's harder." Chloe stared into her tea, the swirl of honey and leaves like a storm on the surface. "Daniel, he's going to look for me." Marcus set the carving down. "Let him look," he said simply. Her eyes filled, not with fear, but with relief, because someone had finally said it aloud, what she had needed to hear since the day she was born into the wrong version of her own life. Let him look, but she would not be found. Not if she chose not to be. To be continued. The static buzzed through the small radio on the kitchen shelf, then cracked open into the familiar drone of the 6 a.m. news. Marcus was already awake, sitting at the table with a steaming mug in his hands, the forest's early light spilling through the windows behind him like a gentle warning. The announcer's voice was calm, practiced, meant for disasters and bake sales alike. Local authorities in Willows are investigating the disappearance of 22-year-old Chloe Lavelle, last seen on Friday evening. Lavelle was expected to marry businessman Daniel Crowhurst next week in what her family described as the social event of the season. Marcus's gaze froze on the cup in his hands. The broadcast continued. Police have not ruled out the possibility of kidnapping. Anyone with information on her whereabouts is urged to contact the Willows Sheriff's Office immediately. Then came the photograph. They must have pulled it from the engagement announcement. Chloe in an off-white dress, smiling beneath a canopy of roses, her shoulders bare, her hand on Daniel's chest. Marcus stared at it until the broadcast rolled into weather updates. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The news had done what it always did, set fire and walked away. Across the hall, the floor creaked. Chloe stood in the doorway, wearing the oversized flannel pajama pants Marcus had given her and one of his old t-shirts that hung like a curtain off her frame. Her hair was still damp from the shower she'd taken before bed. Her face looked half asleep, half erased, but her eyes locked on the radio and stayed there. The voice had stopped, but the echo hadn't. She walked to the counter, turned the volume down with a trembling hand, and leaned against the sink. "I'm not missing," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm not kidnapped. I'm not a victim." Marcus didn't answer. "I'm saving myself," she said louder, her chin beginning to tremble. "Why can't they see that?" Marcus rose without a word, walked to the stove and poured her a cup of coffee. He set it down in front of her and returned to his seat. His silence was not indifference. It was space. Chloe took the mug, held it like something she hadn't earned. She looked at the photo on Marcus's phone again. He'd taken a snapshot of the TV screen. The image haunted her more than the bruise on her arm. It was a version of herself she didn't recognize. Smiling, still silent, like a doll arranged just right. "I hate that dress," she whispered. "I hate who I was in that picture." Marcus finally spoke. "You don't have to be her anymore." Tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't bother to wipe them away. Later that morning, the cabin warmed with light. The trees stood golden and tall beyond the windows. Birds darted across the yard, and a light breeze rattled the chimes made of bent spoons and driftwood on the porch. Marcus opened the closet near the back door, rifled through its contents, then handed her a heavy coat. Faded green canvas lined with wool, the cuffs slightly frayed. It smelled like cedar and something older. Memory, maybe. "This was Lena's," he said simply. Chloe paused. "Are you sure?" Marcus nodded. She slipped her arms into the sleeves. The weight grounded her. It didn't swallow her. It wrapped her. Outside, Marcus handed her an axe. She looked at it with wide eyes. He pointed toward the woodpile behind the shed. "We're low." She followed him through the yard. The ground was soft with wet leaves. The air smelled of pine needles and the musk of damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a deer moved through the trees, quiet as breath. The axe was heavier than she expected. Marcus showed her how to plant her feet, how to breathe before the swing, how not to force it, but to let gravity do the work. Her first try was a failure. The blade bounced off the log and nearly caught her shin. She laughed, loud, startling even herself. Marcus raised an eyebrow. She tried again. This time the wood cracked. Each swing after that was a prayer in motion, a release. The rhythm steadied her heartbeat, soaked the muscles of her arms with purpose. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. By the fifth log, sweat slicked her temples. The coat had grown too warm. She pulled it off and laid it gently over a stump, then rolled her sleeves. The sun peeked through the trees and kissed her bare skin. Marcus worked beside her, wordless, letting the sounds of the axe in the forest speak for them both. Time stretched, then folded. And when they finally stopped, Chloe leaned against a post and looked around. The world hadn't changed, but she had. She glanced at the coat again. Not just an old garment anymore, but armor, inherited. To be continued. The morning fog had begun to lift, but inside the cabin something heavier hung in the air. Not smoke, not dust. Truth. Chloe sat at the wooden kitchen table, her fingers gripping the edges of a small black notebook. Her knuckles were pale, her breath tight. She looked at Marcus across the table, his eyes waiting, patient but alert. Like a man who knew danger often arrived wearing calm. "I didn't know when I'd be strong enough to show you this," she said quietly. "But I think, maybe now." She opened the journal slowly, not to the beginning, but to a spot 3/4 in. Pages that had been smudged by water, fear, and time. Inside was a USB drive, taped carefully between two entries. She peeled it out with deliberate fingers and handed it to him. Marcus didn't ask questions. He stood, slid the drive into the back of his laptop, and opened the only file it contained. A video. The grainy image flickered to life. A poorly lit room, a phone propped behind a stack of books, capturing a narrow but damning angle. Chloe stood at the edge of the frame, her arms crossed, eyes wary. Daniel's voice filled the room before he entered the shot. "I told you," he said, his voice sharp and low. "You open your mouth to anyone about this, and you'll regret it." Then he stepped into frame. His hand gripped her wrist. She winced. "You belong to me, you understand? There is no running, there is no, and then a slap. Not wild, not impulsive, calculated. The video ended there. Marcus stared at the blank screen. Chloe's voice shook. I left the phone recording by accident at first. Then I realized I needed proof. Because if I ever disappeared, I wanted the truth to survive me. Marcus closed the laptop slowly. You don't need to disappear anymore. She looked at him, eyes swollen but not with tears, with exhaustion. I kept telling myself I could fix him, that maybe I was provoking him, that maybe if I just stayed quiet. Marcus reached across the table, not to touch her, but to ground the space between them with something firm. You don't owe silence to the hand that bruises you. Chloe pulled her sleeve up. The faint purple marks were still there, painting her arm like faded ink. She exhaled. You think this will be enough? That a video and some words in a diary will matter against a man like him? Marcus didn't blink. It doesn't matter what kind of man he is. It matters that you're no longer alone. The room felt different after that. Lighter. Not because the fear had gone, but because someone had agreed to carry it with her. Still, outside the cabin, the world moved with cruel unpredictability. Later that day, Chloe walked with Marcus into the nearest town. Just a few miles west of the forest, a tiny community of diners and hardware stores and people who asked too many questions with their eyes. She wore Lena's coat again, the collar turned up, her hair tucked beneath a knit beanie. No makeup, no rings, no trace of the woman in the engagement photo. They only needed firewood and coffee. But as Chloe stepped into the store, the bell above the door let out its mechanical chime, and across the aisle, a woman in her late 40s blinked hard, her face twisting in recognition. I know you, the woman said aloud, almost to herself. You're... Chloe froze. Marcus stepped between them. Excuse me, he said calmly. We're in a bit of a hurry. But the woman was already reaching for her phone. I saw the news. You're that missing girl, Chloe something. They said she might have been kidnapped. Chloe's face went white. Marcus gripped her elbow gently. Let's go. They walked out before the woman could finish her sentence. But they both knew it was done. As they stepped back into the truck, Chloe looked at Marcus, her face tight. She's going to call the police. Marcus nodded once. Then we better decide, what story do you want to tell? And who gets to hear it first? Back at the cabin, Chloe paced the floor. She could feel her heartbeat in her teeth. Her hands buzzed like wires stripped raw. I can't go back, she said. I won't. You won't, Marcus assured her. But if they find me, if they drag me back to Willows, he'll twist everything. He always does. Marcus poured tea in silence. You have the video, he said finally. You have your voice. You have the truth. That's more than most. But is it enough, she asked again, more to herself than to him. He didn't answer with words this time. He opened the cabinet above the sink, pulled down an old box. Inside were photos, yellowed court documents, letters addressed to a name she didn't recognize, his wife's maiden name. She sat down, read through them. They told a story of a woman abused and broken by a man before Marcus. A man no one believed she left. A man who made her fear sunlight and phone calls. Until she met Marcus. Until she stayed. She gave her testimony once, Marcus said softly. It didn't stop him, but it made sure he couldn't hide anymore. Chloe swallowed, then nodded. I'm not going back, she repeated. But her tone had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was decision. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. And somewhere in Willows, Daniel Crowhurst's world had just begun to shift. Surdiim. To be continued. The humming of tires on gravel was the first warning. Then came the flashing blue and red lights, slicing through the calm of the forest like a butcher's knife. The sun was high by then, but the sudden intrusion of sirens made the clearing around Marcus's cabin feel shadowed. Chloe stood frozen by the woodpile, an axe still in her hands from the morning's labor. The blade slipped from her grip and thudded into the damp earth. They're here, she whispered. Marcus stepped onto the porch, the steam from his mug rising against the wind as calmly as if he were watching birds. But his eyes had gone hard. Down the long dirt path that led to the cabin, 3 police cruisers rumbled into view, flanked by a sleek black SUV Chloe recognized instantly. It was Daniel's. Polished, soulless, and always early. As the vehicles parked, a group emerged. 2 uniformed officers, 1 sheriff with mirrored sunglasses, Chloe's parents, and Daniel Crowhurst, dressed in a tailored blue suit like he was walking onto a movie set instead of a woman's final battleground. Her mother clutched a handkerchief to her face, Her father looked like he'd aged 10 years. But Daniel? Daniel looked pristine, a man prepared to reclaim his prize. "Chloe," her mother called out, stepping forward. "Honey, please come out. You scared us half to death." Chloe ducked behind the side wall of the house, breath tight. She didn't respond. "We just want to bring you home," her father added, his voice more firm. "This is all a big misunderstanding." Daniel took a step forward and addressed the sheriff with a practiced frown. "She's been unwell, stressed from the wedding. You know how it is. She just needs rest and guidance." Marcus moved to stand at the bottom of the porch steps. "This is private property," he said evenly. "Unless you've got a warrant, I suggest you stop shouting like you're auctioning cattle." The sheriff stepped forward. "We have reason to believe a young woman is here who's been reported missing. We're here to ensure her safety." "She's not in danger," Marcus said. "That's not your call." Marcus's hand tightened slightly around the porch rail. "It's hers." From behind the house, Chloe's heart thundered. She could hear every voice, every lie, every offer painted to sound like concern when all she could feel was the noose tightening around her ribs. "She's confused," Daniel said to the sheriff, his voice lowered to just the right tone for manipulation. "And vulnerable. We all just want what's best for her." Chloe clenched her jaw. She stepped out, slowly. Her boots crunched on the gravel, her hair pulled back, eyes wide but unflinching. The silence that followed her appearance was heavy, electric. Her mother gasped, rushing toward her, but Marcus stepped between them. "She'll speak for herself," he said. Chloe looked at the sheriff first, then at her parents, then, finally, at Daniel. He opened his arms slightly, as if preparing for a photo opportunity. "Baby, let's go home." She didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said. Her voice cracked, but didn't break. Daniel tilted his head, that smile still hanging in the corners of his mouth. "This isn't the time for drama, Chloe." She took a breath, then louder. "If I go back, next time they'll find me in a morgue." Silence. The birds had gone still. Even the breeze felt like it held its breath. The sheriff turned to Daniel. "Is there anything you want to say to that?" Daniel scoffed. "She's emotional. Clearly she's been—" "I have video," Chloe said, "of him hitting me, of him threatening me. It's already backed up in 3 places." Daniel's face twitched. Her father opened his mouth. "Chloe, we can discuss this as a family." "We are not a family," she said. "You traded me for business." Her mother's face crumpled. The sheriff shifted his weight, radioed something into his shoulder mic. "This changes things," he said flatly. Chloe turned to Marcus, her voice dropping. "Thank you for giving me a place to be human again." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held pride like an old sacred fire. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Ms. Lavelle, you are not under arrest, but we do need you to come with us to make a statement. Would you be willing to do that?" She looked at the trees one last time, then nodded. "I'll go," she said, "as long as he stays 100 feet away from me." Daniel tried to protest, but this time no one listened. To be continued? The air inside the sheriff's station was clinical. Linoleum floors, overhead fluorescence, and the faint smell of burnt coffee. Chloe sat in a hard plastic chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The bruise on her wrist was still visible, even under the sleeve she kept tugging down. Beside her, Marcus remained calm, unmoving, a pillar carved out of silence. Across the table, the sheriff stared at the laptop screen. The video played again. The slap, the threat, the way Daniel's voice curled around the words, "You belong to me." When it ended, no one spoke for a moment. The room felt colder. Sheriff Wallace leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "That's assault and a threat. If this is genuine, we're not dealing with a missing person anymore. We're dealing with a victim." Chloe didn't flinch. "I told you, I wasn't kidnapped. I ran because I was surviving." Marcus slid a folder across the table. "It's been backed up. 3 locations, 2 off-site," he said. "And there's a notarized statement detailing the date and context of the recording. She wrote it. I witnessed it." The sheriff nodded, his demeanor shifting from skeptical official to alert investigator. "I'm placing a temporary stop on all further attempts to retrieve her," he said, standing. "Until a formal inquiry is launched, no one takes her anywhere." In the waiting area outside, Chloe's parents sat on opposite sides of a couch, visibly rattled. Her mother was on the phone, voice low, sharp, rehearsed. Her father had both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that he hadn't touched. Reporters were already circling the parking lot. Local stations, regional affiliates. One woman held up a printout of Chloe's engagement photo, zoomed in and laminated. The caption below read, Bride vanishes days before wedding. Fiancé speaks out. Chloe watched them from behind the tinted glass. Her stomach turned. They're going to twist this, she said, more to herself than to Marcus. Make it about the wedding, the scandal, not the bruises. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. Moments later, the sheriff returned. We're going to need to take a formal statement. Possibly today, possibly tomorrow morning, depending on available counsel. Chloe nodded. Then, like a ghost rising, her parents appeared in the doorway. Chloe, her mother said, smile brittle. Can we talk to you? Just a moment, alone. Marcus started to stand. It's okay, Chloe said. I need to hear this. They moved to a quiet hallway near the records room. Her mother spoke first. We understand you've been under stress. We just want what's best for you. Her father cut in. But this media storm, it's not helping anyone. The Lavelle name is all over the press. Your image is being used by tabloids. If this gets bigger, Chloe's eyebrows lifted. You're worried about your image? Her mother's smile faltered. All we're saying, her father continued, is maybe we keep this quiet. The video, maybe it's best not to press charges, for everyone's sake. Chloe stared at them. Everyone's sake. Her voice was ice. Her mother stepped closer. We don't want to see you painted as unstable, sweetheart. You left in the middle of the night. People are already saying, what people? Chloe snapped. Your investors? The country club? The committee for televised weddings? Her father's face tightened. Watch your tone. And something inside her cracked. My tone? She exploded. Her voice rose like thunder against the brittle walls of the station. You're worried about my tone when I was almost married off to a man who bruised me like property? People turned. Even the sheriff stepped out of his office. You didn't protect me. You made me into a transaction, Chloe shouted, eyes burning. And no one ever asked if I wanted to live my life or just survive it. Her mother's face paled. Her father took a step back. I'm not your asset, Chloe said. I'm not a headline, and I'm not going back to being silent so you can save face. She turned and walked away. The silence behind her was deafening. Outside the station, reporters surged forward, cameras blinking like predatory eyes. But for the first time, Chloe didn't shrink. She stood in the doorway and looked straight into the lens of the nearest camera. My name is Chloe Lavelle, she said, and this is the first day I get to speak for myself. Inside, Marcus watched her through the glass, and he smiled. A quiet, proud, unshakable smile. It to be continued. The cabin was quiet again, but not empty. After the confrontation at the station, the news vans had pulled away, the courthouse calls had begun, and Chloe was left with the echo of her own voice, the one that had finally spoken truth into the open. But truth had a strange aftertaste. It left her hollow. Light, yes, but exposed. She returned to the cabin alone while Marcus met with the sheriff for follow-up paperwork. The walk back felt like returning to a shell she no longer fit inside. She stepped into the living room and for the first time really looked. There had always been photos on the wall, framed in old wood, dusty at the corners, but she had never paid attention to their details. They had blended into the backdrop of her recovery like books or dried herbs. Just quiet presences that didn't demand her attention. Until now. The frame by the stove caught her eye first. It was crooked, and perhaps that made it real. The photo inside was grainy, but its heart was sharp. 3 figures standing on a lakeside dock. Marcus, much younger, stood in the middle. To his left, a woman with fierce, intelligent eyes and a gap-toothed smile. On his right, a teenage girl with hair like stormlight and a grin so radiant it made Chloe's throat tighten. She stepped closer. The girl couldn't have been older than 15. She looked exactly like Chloe did in the few photos she still allowed herself to remember. Before the silences, before the control, before Daniel. There was something in her expression. That wide-open kind of joy that made people uncomfortable. The kind that gets taught out of girls when they grow up. Chloe reached up and touched the frame lightly, brushing the dust from the glass. She turned, scanning the rest of the wall. Another photo, same girl, older this time, maybe 17. A medal around her neck. Standing in front of a high school stage. Same eyes, same stubborn light. Underneath it, a newspaper clipping yellowed with time. The headline read, Tragedy strikes local family. Teen dies after domestic altercation. Chloe's breath hitched. She pulled the clipping from the frame. Her hands trembled as she read. Lena Cartwright, 17, died Saturday after a fall in her home during what investigators have called a domestic dispute. Authorities confirmed her stepfather, whose name is being withheld, was questioned but not charged. Witnesses say the altercation began after Lena attempted to leave the home. There was no mention of her real father, but Chloe didn't need it. She knew the story too well. A girl tries to escape. A man uses force. The world shrugs, and another name gets buried beneath words like accident and emotional instability. Chloe sat on the couch, the clipping still in her hand. When Marcus came through the door 20 minutes later, he paused. He saw her, saw the clipping, and didn't flinch. "She looks like me," Chloe said quietly. Marcus nodded. "You noticed. Why didn't you tell me?" He walked over, sat beside her. "Because this isn't my story anymore," he said. "It's yours now." Chloe shook her head. "No, it's both." He looked down at his hands. "She was fire," he said. "Could talk anyone into anything. She wanted to be a pilot. I bought her books on Amelia Earhart. Her stepfather didn't like that. Said it was unnatural. Said she needed to know her place." Chloe closed her eyes. "I tried to get custody," Marcus said. "Her mom and I were separated. It got messy. Court said she was fine where she was." His voice didn't break, but his silence did. "She called me once," he continued, from the kitchen floor. "Said she tripped. But I knew. I knew she didn't." Chloe reached for his hand. "After the funeral," he said, "I came here. Built this place with my hands. I told myself if I ever saw that fire again, in someone else, I wouldn't fail them." Chloe swallowed. The weight of generations wrapped around them like a cold wind. "I thought I was alone," she whispered. "You're not." The fire in the stove crackled softly like a heartbeat. "Two people, two eras. Same wound. But this time there was a witness." She stood and walked to the photograph again, her reflection overlapping with Lena's in the glass. "She should have had more time," she said. "So should you," Marcus replied. Outside, the woods shifted in the late afternoon sun. The light fell across the window and painted both their faces with the same golden hue. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the first time it felt like survival could become more than just escape. It could be healing. Together. To be continued. The courthouse sat at the edge of Main Street, its stone columns worn down by a century of storms and silence. It wasn't a place where justice often happened, more a place where paperwork passed hands and appearances were kept. But on this day, something different stirred in the air. A local judge had granted an emergency hearing after Chloe's legal team submitted the video and a sworn affidavit. The case had escalated fast, too fast for everyone to hide behind influence. By 9 a.m., the building was surrounded. Cameras, reporters, protest signs scrawled with Chloe's name in bold, hopeful ink. Inside, the courtroom buzzed like a hornet's nest. Chloe sat alone at the plaintiff's table, wearing a plain navy dress and no makeup. Her hair was tied back, exposing every line of her face. She wasn't trying to look soft. She was trying to look real. Daniel sat across from her, flanked by his high-priced attorney, and a smirk that hadn't cracked since the case began. Her parents were seated behind him, pale but unrepentant. Her mother refused to look at her. Her father whispered into his phone like this was still a business deal being salvaged. The judge entered. "All rise." The proceedings began with procedural filings, confirmation of video evidence, authentication from digital forensics, official witness lists. Then Chloe was called. She stood, her legs trembling for only a second, then carried herself to the witness stand with the calm of someone who had walked through fire and refused to burn quietly. She took the oath. The prosecutor's questions were direct, clinical. Chloe's answers weren't. "I didn't run away," she said, voice clear. "I escaped. I have a bruise on my rib that proves it, and a recording of him threatening me that no one can ignore anymore." The judge nodded. "And your parents?" Chloe looked toward them, her eyes neither pleading nor bitter, just sharp. "They sold me to a man for reputation," she said. "Called it a wedding, but it was just a contract, one they never asked me to sign." Gasps murmured through the courtroom. The defense tried to object, but the judge waved it off. "The witness will be heard." "And the video?" the prosecutor prompted. Chloe nodded. "That was my safety net, my truth in case I didn't make it." The judge looked at the screen where the footage was now cued. "Play it." The room darkened slightly as the lights dimmed for viewing. The recording began. The words Daniel had spoken, "You belong to me, there is no running," played aloud. And the sound of the slap rang sharper in that silent courtroom than it ever had in Chloe's memories. When the video ended, Daniel leaned over and whispered something to his attorney, but the damage was done. Next, Marcus took the stand. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a flannel shirt and worn boots. He looked like someone who worked with his hands and lived with his ghosts. The prosecutor asked him to explain his relationship with Chloe. "She's not my blood," he said, "but she's the closest thing I've had to a daughter since I buried mine." The room froze. He looked at Daniel, then at the judge. "No man," he said slowly, "no matter how many zeros are in his bank account, has the right to buy a woman's silence. And no parent has the right to sell their daughter like a contract extension." Even the stenographer paused. Chloe felt her throat close. For a second, there was only the sound of the judge's pen clicking. "Thank you, Mr. Cartwright," the prosecutor said. When he stepped down, a ripple moved through the courtroom, a subtle shift in breath and posture, like the moral compass of the room had tilted. Outside, reporters were already tweeting it. "No man has the right to buy a woman's silence. Gaku, stand with Chloe." Within an hour, the phrase had gone viral. The judge called a recess. In the hallway, reporters crowded the exits. Protesters held signs. "Believe her. Freedom isn't a contract. Bruises don't lie." Daniel tried to walk out the front door. Someone threw a copy of the wedding invitation at his feet. Later that day, back in session, the judge made no ruling, yet. "This court recognizes that an investigation must proceed into the abuse allegations presented," she said. "In the meantime, Chloe Lavelle is not to be compelled, coerced, or returned to any situation that compromises her safety, autonomy, or dignity." Chloe didn't smile, but she exhaled. For the first time in years, the air didn't taste like fear. It tasted like freedom beginning to root itself in the ground. And outside, the town that once turned away, it stood behind her. For now. Hence to be continued. The church bells never rang. The aisle stayed empty. The white chairs on the manicured lawn remained untouched by guests. The three-tiered cake, decorated in ivory roses and edible gold, was boxed away in silence. And the band that had rehearsed Canon in D for weeks never even unpacked their instruments. Because there would be no wedding. Daniel Crowhurst was under formal investigation, not just for the assault on Chloe, but for a string of sealed complaints that began surfacing like bones in thawing soil. Former girlfriends, some from years past, came forward. Stories eerily similar. Bruises hidden, threats whispered, lawyers paid to forget. But not this time. This time a girl had spoken, and the world hadn't turned away. As for the Lavelles, their names quietly disappeared from donor plaques, real estate contracts, and charity brochures across Willows. Projects they once funded went dormant. Invitations were rescinded. Calls went unanswered. Reputation, it turned out, was fragile when built on the backs of daughters. Back at the cabin, the forest had started to bloom again. Spring seeped into the roots of every tree. The creek behind Marcus's workshop thawed, babbling with a voice that Chloe swore sounded a little like hope. She still wore the same flannel jacket most mornings, boots laced tight. But there was something different now, not in what she wore, but in how she walked. Grounded upright, no longer waiting for something to break. On what would have been her wedding morning, Chloe woke to birdsong instead of violin. No makeup artist, no curling iron, no veil. Just the scent of firewood and fresh coffee, and the sound of Marcus chopping pine in the distance. She sat at the old table in the corner of the cabin, the one where her fear had once spilled out in ink, and opened the journal she had once sworn never to reopen. The pages were still crinkled with water damage. Her old handwriting was tight, panicked. A different girl's voice. She flipped past those pages, to a blank one, and she began to write. This isn't a diary of escape anymore. It's a record of what happens when a girl stops running and plants her feet. This is the start of something new. Not a fairy tale, not a movie, just life. Mine. She paused, the pen hovering, then added, and for the first time, that's enough. By noon, she and Marcus drove into town, not to hide, but to live. They picked up supplies from the market. Chloe helped a girl find the right brand of pasta in aisle 3. No one whispered, no one stared. One older woman approached her with cautious eyes, then reached into her bag and handed Chloe a small envelope. Inside was a card. It read simply, "You gave my daughter courage, thank you." Chloe blinked away the sting behind her eyes and smiled. Later that week, she applied to audit community college classes. Writing, sociology, women's rights. Marcus helped her build a bookshelf. The last piece they nailed into place was a photo of her, not in a dress, not in a headline, but beside Lena's picture on the mantle. 2 girls, different decades, same fire. And finally, someone had let it burn into light instead of ash. As the sun began to fall behind the trees that night, Chloe stood at the porch, sipping tea from a cracked ceramic mug. The same breeze that once carried her fear now felt like breath returning to her lungs. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. Because this morning didn't need a wedding to matter. It needed only one truth. She had survived. And now, she would begin. Itataneka. End. The trees had begun their slow green bloom again. It was the kind of spring that didn't arrive with fanfare, but with quiet insistence. The moss thickening at the roots, the breeze warming just enough to leave the windows cracked. Life here didn't announce itself. It returned like breath. The cabin was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming something else, a beginning. Behind it stood the old wooden shed, half rotted when Chloe first arrived, leaning sideways as if too tired to stand. It had once stored broken tools, memory-damp boxes, and 1,000 reasons to let it decay. Now it had a roof again, a new door, a large window that faced the pines. Marcus had started calling it the workshop, but Chloe had other plans. It took weeks, sanding, framing, sweeping out mouse nests. They built shelves out of salvaged cedar, cleaned old jars, arranged nails by size, and hung handmade hooks along the beams. Chloe brought in a table she'd found at a nearby salvage yard, painted it blue, then repainted it white when the blue didn't feel right. On it, she laid out her first set of leather bracelets, hand-stitched canvas satchels, and one small wooden box carved with the outline of a feather. The sign out front was barely a sign at all, just a piece of wood carved with the word mend. That was all she needed to say. Customers trickled in from nearby towns, tourists on hiking trails, women from shelters who whispered stories and left with gifts they hadn't paid for. No one asked too much, no one stared too long. The workshop wasn't famous, but it was known. Chloe's hands grew stronger, her scars faded slower, but they faded. Some afternoons, Marcus joined her, offering help with lumber, sharpening tools, fixing hinges. They didn't speak about the past unless it called for them, and when it did, it was gentle. Not a retelling, just a release. There was no romance between them, no need for labels, just the daily act of rebuilding what the world had once tried to unmake. They cooked together, sometimes in silence, sometimes with music humming low from the radio. They existed in the kind of harmony that didn't ask questions like, "What are we?" but instead offered things like hot tea, well-oiled hinges, and space. One morning, Chloe stood at the edge of the clearing with her hands buried deep in the pockets of a canvas apron. The scent of pine surrounded her. Sunlight filtered through the trees like liquid gold. A deer stepped into view, pausing as if considering her, then moved on. No threat, no warning, just coexistence. She smiled. Behind her, Marcus hammered a new shelf into place. Neither of them spoke. The moment didn't require it. Later that afternoon, she returned to the cabin, pulled out her journal, and carried it outside to a spot beneath the tallest pine. The bark flaked under her fingers as she leaned against it. The wind combed her hair like an old friend. The journal felt heavier than before, not from weight, but from history. Pages that had once been soaked in fear were now anchored in quiet. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. She flipped to the last page. The pen in her hand didn't shake this time. For years, I thought survival was the end goal. That if I could just get out, I could rest. But healing is quieter. It doesn't come with applause or headlines. It comes with sanding wood, with learning names of birds, with watching someone sit beside you and not ask you to speak. She paused, then wrote one final line. For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid to call this place home. She closed the journal, set it beside her, and looked up through the branches. The sky above Willows wasn't vast, it wasn't dramatic, but it was open. And for a girl who had once counted exits in every room, that was everything. Freedom didn't roar, it whispered. And it had finally found her.